Welcome, everyone, to the fifth installment of our Conversations with Olmsted series. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, the managing partner of the Olmsted 200 campaign. We have at last arrived 2022, the year of Olmsted, and we invite everyone from coast to coast to participate in a vast array of programs, conferences, tours, and more around the country. Please visit olmsted200.org to learn more. Today, we are going to start in Mr. Olmsted's neighborhood, the community of Brookline, Massachusetts. Some rare neighborhoods hold a unique place in our history because they were home to an extraordinary confluence of talented individuals. And that is surely the case in the Green Hill neighborhood of Brookline, Massachusetts. There, Frederick Law Olmsted, Henry Hobson Richardson, and Charles Sprague Sargent, and others worked in close proximity, shaping 19th and early 20th century architecture and landscape design in ways that continue to reverberate today. That's why the National Association for Olmsted Parks and other organizations across the country fought hard to oppose proposed plans that surfaced in 2020 to destroy Henry Hobson Richardson's home and properties associated with John Charles Olmsted, the stepson of Frederick Law Olmsted and partner in the Olmsted firm. And as we start the new year, I have good news. We are grateful to the Brookline Preservation Commission, Brookline Preservation staff, Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, Friends of Fairstead, Richardson and Olmsted scholars, and many others who advocated for the preservation of the Richardson house and two properties associated with John Charles. Particular thanks to the Brookline Town Meeting, which has approved the creation of a local historic district that will help preserve these important properties for posterity. Having said that, our goal today is not to focus on Brookline, although we could surely do so. Our goal today is to take this remarkable neighborhood and the collaborations it engendered as a jumping off point. What can we learn from these collaborations? At a time when America was rapidly turning into an urban and industrial society, how were Olmsted, Richardson, and Sargent reimagining public spaces? This seems a particularly timely examination as we find ourselves today engaged in an important and continuing conversation about public spaces and about equitable access to green and open spaces for all Americans. What can we learn from the work of these individuals over 100 years ago? To address these issues, we have found four extraordinary individuals who will explore these ideas this afternoon. After a conversation with them, we'll take questions from the audience, and please let us know where you're from in the chat box, but submit any questions you have through the Q&A box. We will answer as many audience questions as possible and end our program at 1 hour. With that, let me introduce our panelists. Our moderator, Keith Morgan, is Professor Emeritus of History of Art and Architecture at Boston University, where he taught from 1980 until 2016. Keith served as the Director of Preservation Studies, the Director of American and New England Studies, and the Chairman of the Art History Department. His books include Community by Design, The Olmsted Firm and Development of Brookline, Massachusetts. Rosetta Elkin is a research associate at the Arnold Arboretum, Harvard University, as well as associate professor at McGill University. Rosetta is a designer and scholar focusing on how societies represent, respect, and cultivate the earth. She was the recipient of the Garden Club of America Rome Prize Fellowship in 2017. Hugh Howard is author of more than 20 acclaimed books about architecture and landscape, presidents, and painting. His newest book is out today, Architects of an American Landscape, which explores Frederick Law Olmsted and Henry Hobson Richardson. I am reading it right now, and I highly recommend it. And we are pleased to have Dan Marriott, Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at Penn State. Dan is a licensed landscape architect and principal and founder of Paul Daniel Marriott and Associates, looking at the intersection of landscape, transportation, preservation, and planning. Dan is also a member of the board of the National Association for Olmsted Parks. Keith, I will turn it over to you and let you set the stage. Thanks to one and all.
Thank you, Dee Dee, and welcome again, everyone. My task this afternoon is to facilitate a conversation between three specialists that will look at the roles that three leading figures in the design fields in the 1880s who happened to be living next door to each other in Brookline, Massachusetts, the roles they played in reimagining the American public landscape and how their examples could be brought forward for contemporary problems. Could I have the first slide, please? Frederick Law Olmsted that you see on the left-hand side of this trinity is somebody I'm sure is well known to everyone in the audience, the man who defined the field of landscape architecture in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. In the middle, dressed in monk's robe to contain his enormous girth, is the architect Henry Hobson Richardson, who in the same years came to dominate the practice of architecture in the United States until his death in 1886. And finally, on the right, Charles Sprague Sargent, a man who became the nation's leading authority on North American trees. These all three came to live in the Green Hill neighborhood of Brookline, if I could have the next slide, please, where they were adjacent to each other at a walking distance that meant there was great interaction between the three. This was an elite area of Boston's most affluent suburb. Sargent, who grew up in this neighborhood in a 150-acre estate called Homlea that consumes much of the bottom of this map, was appointed in 1872 the director of the Harvard Botanical Garden, and the following year became the director of the new Arnold Arboretum, a research center of Harvard University that was also an early component of the Boston park system designed by Olmsted, with the assistance occasionally of Richardson as well. Richardson and Olmsted, who live on the periphery of the Homlea property, Richardson to the left and Olmsted up above, were both friends from the 1850s, where they were neighbors in Staten Island, Long Island, and frequent collaborators thereafter. When opportunities in Boston came their way, they began to relocate, first Richardson in 1874, and then Olmsted in 1883 to suburban Brookline, where they opened offices as adjuncts of their suburban residences. All three of these were nationally important sites from which major decisions were made. And now we want to focus less on what happened in the 1880s in Brookline, but bring it forward to learn what their innovative and radical solutions could pose as examples for the problems of our own days. So I'll turn to our panelists with a general question to begin with. Here we are in 2022, the 200th anniversary of Olmsted's birth, honoring Olmsted's legacy. How did you get interested in Olmsted, and why do you think the work of Olmsted and his colleagues matter today? And perhaps as a member of the NAOP board, we should turn to Dan first.
So Keith, thank you very much for the introduction. A pleasure to represent the NAOP board in addition to Dee Dee. Dee Dee mentioned at the start of this, the idea of this confluence in this neighborhood in Brookline. And what drew me to Olmsted in my career and this whole period of history is this idea of confluence, connection, collaboration. And I think this is an extraordinarily important thing to keep in mind as we begin this conversation today, is what's happening among these people and the interdisciplinary relationships that they have with one another. This is a rich period in American history with divergent opinions, ideas, and talents coming together to problem solve in a large way. If I have the first slide, please. This is an image of Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Many of you probably know this is a great historic landscape. This is also a result of public health, removing burial grounds from city centers and looking at the idea of burial ground being a park, a scenic place to go touring, and as an arboretum. So this idea of multi-purposes coming together and solving problems. Next slide, please. it's easy to look back on these gauzy, lovely images of the past or that current one of today and forget about the fact that these gentlemen, this period, the population were up against tremendous challenges because of technology. This is hydraulic mining during the California gold rush, not your typical image of the miner panning for gold in a clear stream. Massive environmental destruction. Right after that, next slide, please. The American Civil War, the first modern war where we realized we were truly capable of destroying the environment in our landscape. Next slide, please. So to me, it's all the more remarkable that these individuals are thinking and planning big ideas, connecting parks, such as we see here as one of the Brookline parkways. Also, this is multimodal. Horseback riding, carriage riding, bicycling, promenading. They're thinking ahead globally for all populations and connecting ecosystems through larger green corridors. Next slide, please. We see this even greater with Copeland's vision for Boston. And look at the big ideas here. Taking parts of the existing city of Boston and returning them to green space and connecting everything by these leafy green corridors. It's a magnificent, broad, long-range, futuristic vision of what Boston could be. Now, a lot of this never happened, but nevertheless, I've planted the ideas. Next slide, please. But you see later a regional plan by the end of the century for Boston, with Charles Eliot leading the call for this. The bits in green are existing parks. The orange are proposed parklands. And if you look at the inset I have on the right, you can see the Emerald Necklace, a tiny, tiny part of this grand vision now. This predates the automobile. This predates much of what areas people never considered would be developed. But there's this idea of the future, thinking out hundreds of years in advance and planning for the ecology, for public health, for public engagement, for civic space. And last slide, please. This is the infrastructure connecting this all through this massive investment in land and talent and people. And today we'll be looking at three of these very, very talented individuals and how these intersections came together in Brookline, in this area, and globally. So I'm very pleased to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Hugh, may I pass the baton to you next to respond to that same question?
Yes. Well, truthfully, I came to write about Olmsted kind of through the back door, in that I proposed to write a book about Henry Hobson Richardson, who was, for my money, one of the three most important American architects, up there with Wright and Jefferson. In fact, Wright, who was a man very loath to credit anybody else with anything that he did, really admired Richardson and did credit him from time to time. In any case, I pitched the idea for this book to my editor, and he said, well, that's fine. You may want to resurrect Richardson's reputation, but if nobody knows who he is, then who's going to buy your book? At which point, I did much further research and discovered that Richardson, was very close friends, was a very close collaborator, and I think they were kind of mutual inspirations for one another with Frederick Law Olmsted. So I ended up deciding to write a dual biography, which I've done. The second question is, what was, does Olmsted matter today? And I can certainly stipulate to that. Olmsted does matter. As a longtime New Yorker, I know Central Park pretty well from previous books and research. I knew his Civil War writings. But in writing this book, I came across any number of things I didn't know about him, and learned about the breadth of his vision. He designed suburban streets before we really knew we had suburbs, before they really evolved into what we know of them today. He helped save Yosemite and Niagara. His varied career was, significant as a sociologist, as a visionary, something of a genius in shaping the city as a democratic place for everyone.
And Rosetta, can we ask you finally to respond to that as well?
Sure. Well, I'll sidestep the first question, because it's just no exaggeration to say that every landscape architect knows of Frederick Law Olmsted, and it's hard to pinpoint when one finds out. Having grown up in Montreal with the Montreal Mountain, and then visited a great deal, very often New York, and seeing Central Park because my mother is from there, I sort of grew up with Olmsted in the DNA of all city making. But in terms of the second point that you make, or to speak of the future in terms of what Olmsted was able to achieve in his time, is to understand how remarkable he was at cultivating relationships. And that's not just with relationships with other individuals like Sargent, but also relationships with the natural world that he was then able to somehow embody and reproduce in a really meaningful way for a much larger public. He did so as a true visionary, and I can only say that I still think, despite having grown up next to a couple of his very well-known public spaces, that the Arnold Arboretum, one of the jewels in the Emerald Necklace, remains one of his most, I suppose, formative landscapes for me, both because it represents that health and well-being that Dan was referring to, as well as an incredible relationship both with Sargent, one that I think most of the audience members know about, but we can touch on later, but also with the city of Boston and Harvard University. Those are some hard relationships to negotiate, right? For those of you that don't know, in 1882, the Arnold Arboretum and the city of Boston reached an agreement on this kind of very unique public-private collaboration. Harvard University donated the land of the Arboretum. The director, Ned, always makes a joke, so I'll just echo Ned and say it's probably the first and last time Harvard ever gave anything away. In any case, Harvard donated the land to the city to have it incorporated into the developing Boston Park system and to open it for the public, for public enjoyment and for education, to make education public. And in turn, the city leased the land back to the Arboretum for the purposes of research and education, and committed itself to managing for public use the grounds through construction and maintenance of roads, walls, fences, gates, and to some extent sufficient security. And it's probably less known to many of our guests that the Arnold Arboretum doesn't receive funding of any kind from Harvard University. So the fact that, since this inception of an incredibly unique space, having, 1879 or so was the original design, all the way up until 2022, is truly a testament to that relationship building that Olmsted and Sargent developed.
Thank you, Rosetta. Can I return to Hugh then and ask you to tell us how Olmsted and Richardson reimagined public spaces and what we can learn from them today, using whatever example is appropriate.
I'm going to take us to Shoveltown, you might call it. It's a small city of northeastern Massachusetts. When Olmsted and Richardson got engaged there, it was the place where most of the shovels used in the world were manufactured. It was a mill town, and the downtown looked like just what it was, a great, big, busy place with workers' housing and mill buildings and dead-end streets, a place that had evolved very randomly over a period of decades as the business had exploded. But the family that owned those buildings, that owned the factory, their name is Ames, A-M-E-S, they decided to create a new town center that was less higgledy-piggledy, and they hired Olmsted and Richardson to go about doing that. Let's go to the slide here, slide number 1, if you would, please. And I think the town hall is the place to start. And this image, in a sense, almost tells the story by itself. The lighter pencil lines you see on here are the work of a draftsman in Henry Hobson Richardson's architectural offices. And you can see the building that's limned there has a tower, it has an arcade with low arches, very typical of Richardson's Romanesque style, for which he became famous. But literally this very drawing, this piece of paper, was handed to Frederick Law Olmsted after Richardson decided what the building ought to look like, in order that Olmsted could set it into the landscape. And so the darker lines that you see on here, which I think are brown ink of some sort, scholars believe, and I concur, were almost certainly the work of Olmsted's own hand, as he decided how this building ought to sit on this rise that overlooked an intersection, not very busy intersection at that point in Northeastern. The completed building, which we'll see in this next slide here, although man-made, I think it really looks like it belongs on that rugged hill. You know, it's as timeless and natural almost as it was before Richardson and Olmsted or any of the Ameses came along. But Olmsted wasn't done. This is sort of one of a number of different stages, and I won't walk you through all of them, but the next one was significant because he was then hired to make a monument. We're going to go to another slide here, to commemorate the Civil War. And he wanted to do it in a way that engaged the people of the town. So he imagined a monument that has, you can see a kind of Richardson arch here, but it also has a platform. It also has a flagpole you can't quite see. But he imagined it as the work of many hands, that the kids of the town would put pebbles on it, the adults of the town, the grown-ups of the town would put larger stones on it, and they would create a monument stacked in memory to the Civil War dead. And it would be the centerpiece of this new downtown development, which we will see as it evolved a few years later in the next slide. You can see the monument is kind of at the center there of this triangular intersection. And pretty soon there was a school across the street. Pretty soon there was a little bit of mercantile development down the block. There was also a library that Richardson built. So all of a sudden, they had, thanks to the shared thinking of Olmsted and Richardson, a new focus for this town. Some very imaginative thinking.
Thank you. A good example. And Rosetta, can I come back to you again with more or less the same question to help us understand how Olmsted and Sargent, through specific examples, created new models that are important for us to keep in mind today?
Yes. Well, that novel agreement that I described earlier, it's important to recognize that it was signed for a 1,000-year lease, and it's renewable once. So in the fine print, you recognize that Olmsted and Sargent were thinking for the long term about generations that they were far beyond them. And that's the real takeaway for myself anyways, and I hope for others, that we need more long-term thinking. And I mean really long-term thinking about whether or not a seawall is going to crumble in 20 years is just not good enough anymore. If Olmsted and Sargent were working today and collaborating today, climate change and landscape change would be forefront in their thinking. And the public's knowledge and literacy of that change would also be forefront in their thinking, as education was so important to both of them. And I want to point out that, so I would say, one, long-term thinking, two, recognizing the changes in the changes in the landscape are not only from the time of the design and the creative partnership, but that 7,000 years prior, there were indigenous peoples. There 11,000 years before, the land was rising up from the Ice Age. I mean, landscape change is on such a long durée, and it's very important, I think, to humble ourselves and place our society within a much longer time frame than a lot of municipal budgets and mayoral cycles often allow. And that's really where we can do better, I would say. An example, if we could pull up the images. That image one, there is the Arborway entrance in 1903. The width of that entrance, the inviting kind of embrace that is designed into a public space, not a small marginalized entry, but rather really the feeling of everyone is welcome here. Please enjoy the grounds. And if we go to the second slide, what's important about contextualizing that is that when you have a really integrated, this is the Arboretum, just to be clear, integrated into the city planning, you can't have one entrance. And what public, save a library. Perhaps we can talk about that with Richardson. What outdoor public space should only have one entrance? On the contrary, there are at this point over 29 entrances of formal and informal nature at the Arboretum. It is porous to the city around it because Sargent and Olmsted advocated for no fences, essentially, and no walls. And that is also something that current park planning could really learn from. And it's because of this plan that during the pandemic, the Arboretum was able to stay open when other botanical gardens and arboreta closed. And that is such a critical public infrastructure for the long term.
Thank you. And Dan, as our Olmsted scholar, can we come to you to close out this question, thinking about Olmsted's relationship to Richardson, Sargent, Burnham, and others, and what can we learn about that collaboration today?
I think, and I'll echo what Rosetta just said as well, it's this idea of long-term vision, long-range planning, and thinking beyond the next 20 years, 200 years out, or 1,000 years out with a lease for Arnold Arboretum. I think right now, as we look at climate change and the pandemic, one of the most important things I think we can learn is collaboration and the role of design in terms of solving larger problems. I think we've lost a lot of that conversation right now. We focus on climate change in terms of we have to put up a seawall, we have to change forest management programs, et cetera. Pandemic, like how do we make people safe? What about the vaccine? All these things are all being very based on science and a conversation. And I think the idea of design and the role of design in problem solving are things that these three men and women across the board during this period of the 19th century were thinking much more broadly about. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts had the first state public health department in the United States. And in the late 19th century, the Massachusetts medical profession, with the Olmsted firm, developed a plan for public health for metropolitan Boston. Most American cities were suffering from waterborne diseases such as typhoid, cholera, and malaria, and we forget that nowadays. There was a major public health crisis. What to me is so remarkable was that it wasn't just the medical profession, but the value of landscape architecture and the idea of looking at the larger ecosystem and public health benefits of a functioning, healthy waterway network within metropolitan Boston. So with people like Charles Eliot taking the lead, we see the Metropolitan Park District established. And we see the state putting money behind this too. This was not just a big idea that sounded good on paper. This was funded and supported by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And there were all the extra benefits: public health with clean water, recreation, setting aside lands to keep the public water system clean, also provided places for public recreation. And these are called reservations because they knew at the time they weren't exactly sure how they might be used. But thinking ahead to the long, distant future, they had these land areas set aside and they were connected with parkways. So you could move through the system in green. And the parkways ended up following the river corridors, which were protected, which provided scenic driving and recreation. So all these things cycling back and forth. And why I showed that earlier image of Mount Auburn Cemetery at the start was, again, the problem was burying people in Boston was contaminating public water wells. So we looked it out. But it wasn't just relocating the cemetery function. It was about recreation. It was about arboreta, all of these ideas. And I think this is the lesson for us: inspiration, collaboration, and the role of design in terms of taking scientific problems and making them civic investments.
Thanks so much. As a great fan of Charles Eliot, I'm glad to see him brought in there to remind people that they're members of the Olmsted firm whose last name don't begin with O. Hugh, can we come back to you? In your new book, you note that Richardson wanted to break away from European influence and create an American architectural idiom. Is there something distinctly American about the way that these individuals imagined public space? All three of them, potentially.
The public library is something that comes to mind first in this context, Keith, and that is, we take them for granted today, public libraries. But in 1850, there was no place that a member of the hoi polloi could just go take a book out, could go and borrow a book. They just didn't exist. They began to appear thereafter, although for the most part in the early years, they tended to be a room in an apothecary upstairs downtown, or maybe in City Hall or Town Hall or something like that. But by the time Richardson came along, they were beginning to think seriously about freestanding buildings, and he designed a half dozen of them that ended up being significant paradigms for others. In fact, the first of the Carnegie libraries was based very closely on a Richardson design. And a fair amount of the time in those half dozen libraries, I think in at least 4, maybe 5 of the cases, Olmsted was hired to sit them into the landscape. So I think we should see a picture here. I got slide 5 here. This is one of the libraries that he did. It's in Malden. That's not the right slide. We need to go on to slide 5. There we go. That's in Malden, Massachusetts. Although this drawing comes from Richardson's office, it very much reflects Olmsted's thinking. And for me, it feels like it's a little bit park-like. It feels like a little bit of a restful oasis for the body, just as once you get inside, there's stimulation for the mind. A second example I'd give here of his peculiarly American work is really a consequence of the way of their American work, of the way the American society changed radically in the course of the 19th century. When Olmsted was born, pretty much everybody lived within a mile or 2 of countryside, and therefore they could get a taste of nature, if you will. In the ensuing decades, with a population that grew 8-fold in Olmsted's lifetime, all of a sudden the city exploded, and suburbs, which hadn't existed at the beginning of that time, let's go to the next slide here, came into being. And they had to have some methodology for getting back and forth, which was the railroad, which of course was this immense economic driver also. And here's a railroad station designed by Richardson, long and low, seated nicely in the landscape, fitted in beautifully by Olmsted's, permanent plantings. You don't see flower beds here. You see trees and bushes and a little bit of hardscape. And I think together they made these suburban train stations into very welcoming portals for these suburban towns. Olmsted created dozens of railroad landscapes. Richardson fewer railroad stations because he didn't live that long. But I think this is a classic example of a kind of public civic architectural landscape plan that they created and integrated.
And the fact that Charles Sprague Sargent was on the board of the Boston and Albany Railroad means that he was also instrumental in bringing about that partnership too. I think it's a great example.
He hired them both, no question.
Yes. Can I come back to Rosetta and then move on to Dan and Hugh with a question? Landscape architect and Olmsted advocate Laurie Olin praises Olmsted and his colleagues for their ability to think at the scale of the problem. How should practitioners today think at the scale of the problem? Can the efforts of Richardson, Olmsted, and Sargent help us reimagine public space in helpful ways for the future?
Scale is a very interesting topic that you can't really get away from in landscape. We talk about telescopic scale in landscape. You have to get down to the microscopic and then way back up into the territorial, the whole continent and beyond. And that's nowhere more evident in how 21st century land use has evolved. I'd go back to also just referencing something that Dan mentioned in terms of the Commonwealth. And I think that a Commonwealth politics of today, one would have to ask what wealth itself means and what is the value of life. And I'm sorry to get a little bit heavy, but I think it really is important that we ask ourselves in this day and age what a Commonwealth is. And common space has, especially in Boston, starting with the Commons and beyond, sort of underscored our ability to feel a sense of freedom and connectivity with a greater public. But now more than ever, there is less and less space. Something that we mentioned in conversation was sort of this idea of what do we evolve, right? I mean, I think what Laurie is referencing is also the visionary aspect of thinking big, but I also would caution us to also think little, because we can do a lot with the spaces that we have. Olmsted thought big because there were very expansive spaces, and he could imagine transforming them, and he did through acts of essentially stewardship and conservation. But what we have now in overbuilt, urbanized, and more and more polarized social environments is we have less and less space. So what can we do with that, right? And so rather than evolve the present, rather than evolve the present state, i.e. evolve the boundaries of the Arboretum or the boundaries that exist of the Boston Commons and the Emerald Necklace, how can we evolve to the future? What would a next generation commons look like? What would a Commonwealth Commons look like in the 21st century? And I think those are the kind of questions that certainly Laurie asks in his practice, and ones that I hope that our leadership will begin to ask in this century.
Dan, can we come to you next?
Yeah, great. These are great questions. And I'm glad we were prepared for them as well. So I think when we think about all this, the idea of scale, right? Anticipating, people have trouble envisioning change. People don't often like change, and people quickly accept change. Olmsted at the end of his life was already arguing that Central Park was not large enough to serve metropolitan New York as he saw it, and he could envision metropolitan New York reaching as far as Connecticut at some point, which people thought was completely ridiculous and so far off the mark. But where Connecticut is very much a part of this sphere of influence with New York City right now. Olmsted's idea, very practically, was that now's the time to be acquiring public lands and protecting spaces before the development pressure is there. And as a landscape architect, today I see myself, communities squandering opportunities for a minor investment right now because they can't envision a level of population, a level of growth, a level of change that goes beyond their view of their world right now, and thinking out for these future generations that we were thinking about so much more strongly, I believe, during this period. I think particularly right now, too, in a divided nation where people are counting pennies, these are not new ideas. There were people actively trying to sabotage Olmsted projects and acquisition of public lands. I would commend to all of you interested in Olmsted to read Public Parks and the Enlargement of Towns, which is a paper that he presented in Boston, looking at how American cities should grow and plan ahead. And importantly, if you're feeling like you're having frustrations going up against the council member or mayor who just doesn't quite get this, Olmsted talks about nefarious and unscrupulous people who will try to undermine these efforts and the need for you to maintain a clarion vision. And to me, if we're looking at the big picture for 20,000 feet, it's having a clarion vision and remembering that the ideas that you have for long-range development, planning, green space are probably quite good. And no one's just going to say, go ahead, let's do it. You're going to have to fight for these. You're going to have to argue for them. You're going to have to defend them after they're built. Olmsted was aware of that, and he managed to keep an optimistic view and a big vision, and he didn't let all this slow him down. And I think all these people in this century were really important with that approach, and I think they're very important lessons for us today with politics and funding.
Thanks, and Hugh, over to you.
In brief, clearly Olmsted thought huge thoughts, but as a relative newcomer to studying Olmsted's life, I've really immersed myself in it for half a dozen years rather than 20 or 30 as my colleagues have. What impressed me pretty early on was that Olmsted didn't think about 5 years down the road, didn't think about 10 years, he didn't think about a generation. He thought about 3 generations and 5 generations and beyond. And he was a visionary in a way that very, very few people are, because folks just don't think in those kinds of terms, and he did. And I think, this is very unspecific, but I think that if we can adopt something of that kind of mindset, that we have to really think way, way over the horizon, I think that's a good place to start some of these discussions.
Okay, I'm going to now switch to questions that have come in from the audience. And hopefully the technology will allow me to do this efficiently. But let's start with a question that seems to reflect issues that many of us have been talking about. What are some of the Olmstedian principles or recommendations that can be used to approach the municipalities in charge of parks to take climate change seriously by taking the proper precautions to mitigate climate change effects on trees and ecosystems? Anyone who wants to jump in? That seems like it has your name written on it, Rosetta, but go for it.
There are four, sorry to be specific, but there are sort of four main principles that you'll find in every Olmstedian landscape. Of course, there are more, but there are four commonly discussed ones. I'm certainly no Olmsted scholar, but there's genius of place, which you've probably heard a lot about, which basically just means let's appreciate the unique characteristics that are here and work with them and not against them, right? Unified composition he spoke of, which is essentially establishing a coherent hierarchy, including what he always called the omission of any decorative planting. So making sure that the composition is robust, and we are actually the generation that's probably living with some of the best examples of that. Then the other one, which Dan referred to, is the orchestration of movement, which is to advocate for separation of traffic speeds always. And we see that now, especially with, electric bikes and scooters. And I mean, wow, anybody who jogs or walks dogs or has a stroller knows about the orchestration of movement. And finally, the orchestration of use, which is a strategic organization of relationships based on what he calls, quote, which I love, the changing needs of the public. So I think that's where we would answer your question, because the changing needs of the public right now are for more access to outdoor space, whether it's to have meetings or to have classes, or, we need more and more open spaces. And that's a changing need that we've seen, so present. And the changing needs of the landscape itself, whether it's more ice storms or hurricanes or droughts and floods and irrigation and non-irrigation. And so that, I hope I'm not too long-winded in trying to answer that question, but hopefully we can all consider how landscapes can be agile to the changing needs of the public if we listen.
Good. Dan, anything you want to add to that?
That was an excellent summary, Rosetta. So I appreciate the clear points that you presented there. I would say that, I think we think about these things very hard and very carefully. And what I have always admired about Olmsted was the idea of having the large vision, but not getting so trapped in it, he would walk away if he couldn't get everything they can. Because I find a lot of times nowadays, well, if we can't have this, we're not going to play, we're not going to participate. What's the middle ground? The parkway system, and this goes back to what Rosetta just mentioned in terms about mobility and access for Brookline, was intended as a serpentine, much more organic system, but we ended up with basically long, straight, razor-straight boulevards. That wasn't the goal. That wasn't the Olmsted plan. But the main goal was connecting green space to green space. And Olmsted accepted that on a very geometric format and a razor-straight line and did it. And he modified it with Buffalo, and it finally reached its apotheosis in Boston with the serpentine system there. So there's a chance to learn and mark and follow. Olmsted realized pretty quickly after Delaware Park was established in Buffalo that it was too far for the working classes, and people couldn't afford the nickel to get to the park. So with the Buffalo South parks, they changed, rather than having one large park, they had several smaller parks that were more accessible to local communities. So I think have the big vision, which we've been promoting a lot, but also I think a lesson from Olmsted too is recognize that your big vision can be modified, it can be corrected, it can be improved. And don't get so stuck in one grand idea that you miss opportunities. And I think Rosetta made a point earlier too, just about sometimes small things can be quite successful too in making very positive change.
And Hugh, anything you want to add to that question?
Echo very quickly Dan's point and point out a piece of Olmsted's history, and that is that he didn't start out as a designer. In fact, he admitted quite late in his career that he wasn't really comfortable with the art thing. That was, awkward for him. he was a manager to start with. He said, I'm going to be able to handle 1,000 workers, so we're going to create this park in New York. And they became 2,000 workers, and somehow he made it all work. Now, clearly, he brought a wonderful imagination to that too. But the practical, the pragmatic is part of what we have to do. We have to make some deals as well as do things that are artistic and visionary, and they have to fit together.
Good, thank you. Another question from the audience. A number of members of the early Olmsted firm, like Henry V. Hubbard, were also involved with designing affordable housing as part of the focus of public welfare. Were they unusual in developing that alliance between public welfare and landscape design?
I can start with that.
Please, Dan.
The history of affordable public housing and landscape architecture goes way back in terms of plan committees and ideas, English Garden City movement. So these ideas of looking at housing and housing's relationship to landscape and providing people with limited means access, again, it goes back to green space, having a garden, having a playground. And we see these ideas moving up through the Depression with places like Greenbelt, Maryland, in terms of planned communities. Aberdeen Gardens, which is the planned community for African-American community in Virginia during a time of Jim Crow. And we can see these going up through the Newtown movements in public housing, real innovations at times. Usually it's not this great, usually it's not this special, but when there's a landscape architect involved, it's usually quite fine and it's worthy of note. And these are examples we can draw down on. But the profession of landscape architecture and affordable public housing, it's deep and it's long and it's meaningful. And I think it shows that you can have a budget and you can have a very specific population you're designing for, you can still do very, very fine work.
I would only add just a tiny little bit to that, which is that Olmsted really did his homework, so to speak, and he traveled all around the world, especially Europe, and in Holland, learned a great deal about social housing, as it was called there, and especially from Coster and whomever, and that had a great influence on him, just as the deer parks of England had an influence on him and whatnot. So I think that the innovation comes in bringing it to a growing America and translating it for the nation in ways that Dan has alluded to, the cities that he worked, so many of them.
You, any further comments there?
I just point out that his whole notion of parks, although it has very little to do with housing, his whole notion of parks was to give people, in particular working class people who didn't have the opportunity to be exposed to nature, to give them that exposure. So he was clearly conscious of not just the fancy folk, but the regular guys too.
Yeah, I'd also add that Olmsted's first intern, Charles Eliot, who spends a fat year in Europe studying landscape architecture, when he's lobbying for the creation first of the trustees of public reservations, a private statewide organization to hold land, and then moving on to create the Boston Metropolitan Park System. He's presenting proposals for affordable housing environments that incorporate open landscape within the block form of the environment. And I think Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. also spent a considerable period of time traveling in Europe and trying to bring back the most innovative concepts of housing variety to the practice and to the country. Okay, let me come to one last question then. This is a quotation. Olmsted was born in 1822, but became a landscape architect rather late in his career at age 43. His ideas evolved from a diverse and unique set of experiences. Comment on the value of diversity in this professional field and in the creation of public spaces.
I would say that Olmsted actually preferred the term landscape gardener. And I think that that's a really important point in this day and age where a lot of the work of building our public spaces is outsourced. and we don't have a personal relationship with it often. One of the things that's maybe we've overlooked, but it's a short conversation. I don't think any of us mean to overlook it, but it was hard on Olmsted. I mean, he broke his back defending these places. He got fired and rehired and ousted and divorced. And I mean, his life was it was very difficult, but what he stuck to was the vision. It wasn't easy for him. And so when I see pictures of him, standing with his cane in the midst of kind of muck up to his knees, even though he had a bad foot, and they're moving trees behind him, I think about how grounded he was as a designer, how in touch with the materials he was as a visionary. Some visionaries stay, 1,000 feet above. And so I suppose in terms of justice, I would also say that, being involved in public land, matters of public land, don't mean you have to go to an accredited university, don't mean that you have to have a diploma from any of the great institutions that we might share. It is actually being activist, being engaged, being part of a community, having your boots on and your shovel ready, and having a vision. And so I really love that question, because I think it's tremendously important in this day and age that environmental literacy is something that's taught, from a very early age, that we can recognize the trees and plants and animals in our environment and teach that as future stewards.
I'm going to unfortunately have to cut off the conversation there because we've extended beyond. No, I thought that was a perfect place to end. So I thank you, Rosetta, for that. And at this point, I'm instructed to pass the baton back to Dee Dee to return us to the NAOP base.
Terrific. Well, thank you, everyone. We got a lively conversation, as we knew we would, and we are just want to say thank you to all of you, and for all of you who have participated this afternoon. We hope that this has been food for thought, and it has been a wonderful way to start the new year. So to everyone, please remember, Olmsted 200 activities are in full swing and will run throughout 2022. We are posting new and diverse programs nearly every day, ranging from virtual programs and education to tours of Olmsted's landscapes, as well as conferences concerning Olmsted designs. March 22 is our next conversation, when we will explore the topic of abolition, civil war, and the American park idea, and we will zero in on Olmsted's 1865 Yosemite report. So please put that on your calendar now. And watch your inbox for invitations to 2 upcoming events to support the National Association for Olmsted Parks, one on April 25th in Central Park at the Boathouse, where Martha Stewart and others will join us to toast Frederick Law Olmsted and his legacy. And in June, we will travel to Chicago and have a dinner in the Glessner House. Yes, appropriately designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, where Olmsted lived when he was designing the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. There, we will also participate in a special bicentennial carillon concert inspired by Olmsted at the University of Chicago. So please check out our website, olmsted200.org, sign up for the monthly newsletter, explore our national calendar, submit your activities, and read our blog. And please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Olmsted200. Thank you for joining us. Cheers to the year of Olmsted, and we'll see you in March. Thanks so much.